important information with regard to grants and conferences that are coming up in March, all housing related, and you're going to want to jot those down. We thought it was very timely to have Ron and Michelle speak today because Nebraska Investment and Finance Authority has their housing study grant applications due March 3rd. So you'll want to take advantage of those. So anyway, we are still onboarding individuals. So we'll just wait here for another minute or two before we get started. Sometimes we tell jokes or share weather stories. It's 25 degrees here in Holdridge right now, but it looks like the sun is shining. I haven't been out yet today, so.
It's pretty nice out. I took a short lunch and it's pretty nice out, but I wanted to know what my phone said. It was -0 this morning. I want to know how that differs from +0. I couldn't quite figure that out. It felt colder though. Just a reminder, if you don't want to be like me and have your phone go off in the middle of the webinar and have everybody wonder what's going on, we've connected our phone system now so it comes in on our computers and our cell phones at the same time that our desk phone is ringing. So when it comes in, it's like the fire alarms are going off. And so I'm trying to remember to put everything on silent. That might be a useful reminder for some of you if you don't want to be jumping around trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. I had that happen earlier this morning. Stacy is giving us an official weather report for Holdridge that it's a huge improvement from this morning. So I don't know what the wind chill was, but Broken Bow said -14 wind chill this morning about 6 o'clock. So, but
well, I received some pictures this morning from friends in the Fremont area, and they're struggling again with the ice jams and the rivers. Actually swept away some houses due to the overflowing from the ice jam. So they're in for another really difficult spring.
Oh, that's too bad. So I have seen a few of those pictures. Not pleasant whatsoever. So, but we are quickly approaching our start time. I'm just going to mention one more time for those of you. We've got some dates on your screen of upcoming events and deadlines as it relates to housing here in Nebraska. Paul, thanks for joining us from Kearney. I see you in the chat box, but March 3rd, NIFA's housing study grant application is due. March 12th, the DED Trust Fund pre-application deadline. March 16th, Nebraska Housing Developers Association is sponsoring an afternoon conference about advocacy for affordable housing at the La Vista Conference Center just ahead of the NIFA Housing Innovation Marketplace Conference on March 17th and 18th. So if you want more information on those, reach out to the groups that are referenced or contact any of us here at SCED and we'll direct you to the right group. So as we wait for any last minute arrivals, I also wanted to put up a poll question for you. Sherry has already launched that. I thought this was really interesting since we are studying and talking about housing today. The question for the poll, here in Nebraska, so this is statewide, if you were working at a $9 an hour minimum wage, how many hours would you have to work each week to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home at fair market rent? And I see somebody has already logged a response. You've got 5 opportunities there. You can choose one. And this information comes courtesy of the Nebraska Housing Developers Association website. They have put on there the 2019 Out of Reach report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition report. While you're all answering this poll question, I also wanted to just give a shout out if you're a first-time attendee here on the HomeNE webinar. We hope you'll find it informative and that you'll make future participation a priority. Some of you we know gather your coworkers and you sit around a monitor or a screen to view our webinars, and we thank you as well. And we also recognize that many of you have participated in a majority of our webinars. And so whether this is your first one or one of many webinars, welcome to today's edition of HomeNE. So, okay, looks like we've got about, a few more. We'll give you about 30 more seconds to answer that poll, and then we'll close it and we'll launch the answer for you. This information is statewide, but if you go to the website, you can also gather county by county information, and I thought that was very interesting. So Matthew Kavanaugh, if you're on the webinar today, thank you for making that information available through your website at Nebraska Housing Developers Association. So let's see. Let's go ahead and close that. Oh, we've got two more. Okay, so we have closed that. 9 of you said 56 hours, and that is the correct answer. So if you are a minimum wage worker and you want a modest 1-bedroom fair market rental, you would work 56 hours a week to afford that modest 1-bedroom rental. So go and check out that report. It's eye-opening and great information. So with that, if you'll close that, Sherry, and I want to honor everybody's time and get started for the afternoon because we have great information and great presenters, and I don't want to delay that anymore. So go ahead and close that, Sherry. Okay. So, well, let me say it if I haven't said it enough already. Good day and welcome to today's online gathering. I'm Lori Ferguson with South Central Economic Development District, and I am going to be your tour guide for today's conversation. Sherry just told me before we logged on, we now have 70 individuals registered from across Nebraska to hear today from Ron Tillery, the Executive Director of Phelps County Development Corporation, and Michelle High, who is a board member of the Phelps County Development Corporation. And they're going to talk today about the importance of and how to utilize a housing study. I'm looking forward to their presentation because this came out of our fall HomeNE gathering when somebody suggested that maybe we should consider a future webinar or a gathering topic centered around housing studies. So I very much appreciate Ron and Michelle and their willingness to talk about this subject today. As I mentioned earlier, we have 70 participants and 8 of you are first time, so welcome. And 5 new communities are represented for the very first time on our webinar today. So a shout out to those of you joining us from Bellevue, from Center, Gordon, Mitchell, and Morrill. So it is indeed becoming a statewide network, and we thank you very much. So to date, 109 different communities across the state of Nebraska have been represented in these webinars. So you'll see on your screen our agenda. We'll hear from our guest speakers, Ron Tillery and Michelle High. Following their presentation, we'll be opening it up for questions for them, as well as that is followed by group discussion and final thoughts. So before I turn it over to Sharon Heffley, I want to just draw your attention to the topic. And as Ron and Michelle share, I encourage you to utilize the chat box throughout their presentation. We'd really like to hear from you and tell us or let us know how their presentation is resonating or speaking with you or to you. Some examples of chat box entries, if you're not familiar or comfortable with using that feature, maybe share an aha that you have during their presentation. Maybe hearing them speak triggers maybe a different way of thinking about the topic in general. Maybe something that you hear either Ron or Michelle say is something that you want to share with people in your home community or with your organization. We just really want you to use that feature and leave your comments, drop in your questions, because we will be monitoring it and asking them questions later on. But we want you to make the chat box come alive as a resource for us to communicate with each other as a community or a dialogue center. So we will be monitoring it as you respond, and we'll share your comments and questions with Ron and Michelle later on. So As I've said, HomeNE is a learning network, and we learn best when we learn and interact with each other. So welcome to all of you, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon Heffley.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the February edition of the HomeNE 2020 webinar series. The South Central Economic Development District acts as the lead agent for these monthly gatherings and monthly webinars and semi-annual gatherings. In November, we held our fall gathering in Holdridge, and we have begun to plan our spring one. Think late June, think second story, repurpose of second story in your community, but we'll just have more information about that as we solidify those plans. So what is HomeNE? It's a learning network that was established in 2017, and it's to build a network of individuals and communities with a shared interest in assessing and addressing their housing issues. It's to provide a safe place to be vulnerable about what's been tried and find motivation to take one more step in the right direction. It's to learn from the successes and struggles of others, and it's to take away new ideas or see things through a new lens. Sometimes we've been looking at things so long and we're so weary, and we get to attend something or hear from somebody else, and all of a sudden it's like we put on new glasses, like, oh, I never looked at it that way. And one of the things that we are learning to say is, is that a problem or is that an opportunity? So the Learning Network is also to inspire you. What you are doing in your community is valuable, and nobody's going to do it quite like you. And now's the time for you to leave your mark. So we hope we can be part of helping you make that mark. Just to share the growth of HomeNE over the past 2 years, if you're on a computer, you can see the map of the location of webinar series participants. And I want you to know it looks like we have a real gap there just before you get to the Panhandle. But if you don't know about rural Nebraska, those 6 counties, just before you get to the Panhandle, they start at the very top of the great big county, that's Valentine. 6 counties below that each have 1 community. So that's the Sandhills. It's a beautiful area, but it's not our most populated area. I hope we get those communities to join because they have issues just like we do, but they don't have, aren't lucky enough right now to have the people that are engaged like you are. So today, like Lori said, we're going to be hearing from Ron Tillery and Michelle High, and they are both affiliated with Phelps County Development Corp, or PCDC as we call them. Let me tell you about them. Ron has been with PCDC as executive director since May of 2016. He returned to Central Nebraska after 6 years in Fremont, serving as executive director of the Fremont Chamber. In Fremont, he led efforts to reinvigorate the business climate, and he worked as a member of the recruitment team for the Costco poultry plant. Prior to that, he lived and worked in Kearney for 21 years, where he guided efforts to build a dynamic and diversified economy with the Economic Development Council of Buffalo County. He also has had a long television career, serving in management positions at stations in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Nebraska. Kind of surprised he doesn't say HomeNE. But since he's been here, he has recruited the Cobblestone Inn and Suites to Holdridge, here being Holdridge. I guess when we're virtual, you don't always know where we are. The Cobblestone Inn is a $4.25 million project. He assisted to bring $518,500 in grant funding for rural workforce housing in Holdridge. He's created the Go Home programs to support housing development for more than 160 new residents in less than 2.5 years. So those are all exciting things. I'm eager to hear from Ron. Michelle is a commercial and agriculture loan officer for Bruning Bank in Holdridge. She and her husband Scott also farm near Bertrand. Michelle has been a PCDC board member since 2005, and she currently serves as secretary treasurer. She also served as president in 2009 and 10. She's a dedicated volunteer. She's actively promoted housing and community development programs throughout her professional career, including the formation of a county-wide housing steering committee. So welcome to the HomeNE, Ron and Michelle. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you to SCED. We really need housing activists and partners like SCED to get things done in our respective communities. We're very grateful for the partnership we've had with you.
Absolutely.
So we're not necessarily a dynamic duo in terms of presentation style, but we're happy to share with you what we've learned and some of the things we've tried to make a difference in our community. Clearly, housing's a difficult thing to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, what do we have, 37 people or 37 computers active right now. And as Lori was saying, 70 registrants. So clearly a lot of people recognize that housing is an important thing to do. And today we're going to talk about housing studies, which is one of the most important tools in your respective tool chests to construct housing in your respective communities. Well, first we want to talk about what you're going to get out of a housing study. And as you can see in the slide, the statistical and narrative data is very, very important. It'll provide a housing profile, which includes the age of your housing stock, the different kinds of housing stock that are in your community, its condition, and it will provide a roadmap of the things that are necessary to occur in your market. It provides past, present, and projected demographics. More importantly, it is another source of data that can be compared with other sources of data that you may already have in your community. And for us in Holdridge, we recognize that we have a large commuting population in for jobs in our market, maybe a larger inbound commuting population than you would ordinarily find in a smaller Nebraska community. I think we have a net inbound population of somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 people. That presents a problem and an opportunity to us, and we've tried to structure our responses to take advantage of the opportunity. We also see in a complete housing study the economic and structure and the housing conditions in the market. Essentially scheduling or identifying what the demand is in the market. So if you would go to the next slide, Sherry. In order to conduct a housing study, it really is most effective if you can assemble a broad partnership of different constituency groups. You not only get the feedback and the information from those constituents, but you also strengthen the partnership. Rather than having a single entity drive the process, which may be easier in some respects, a broad coalition of partners strengthens not only the process, but it also provides a broad base of support once the study is complete and you're ready to begin using the data that's provided. You know, a lot of times you'll find a city or a municipality will be the sole funding partner of a housing study. And I can't argue against that, except to say that when you have not only a municipality, but also private enterprise, other nonprofit groups, a broader coalition of people, when you get ready to roll out those findings, it's going to have the support from a broader coalition, and it will be more effective when you go to implement that the findings in the study. So, and
Can you give an example of some of the ones we've used in the past?
Well,
who we've partnered with?
In our case here in Holdridge, we obviously have the city as a partner. But we also had some of the larger employers in town that were involved, such as the hospital. PCDC, of course, was a funding partner. I can't recall all of them. We had about a half a dozen different funding partners involved in our study. So I would encourage anybody that's contemplating a housing study to form a committee, a broad-based coalition, employers and municipalities and other government sources, including school districts, to be a partner and participate in the process. If you could go to the next slide, Lori, or Sherry. You've got your finger on the button, don't you, Sherry? Define the region that you want to measure. In our case, we did a county-wide study. Phelps County Development Corporation is just that. It's a county-wide organization. So, and we also recognize that many of the smaller communities in our county are places where people live who actually work in Holdridge. So we didn't want to confine the study to only Holdridge. We decided to broaden our study and the scope of that to include the entire county. So our housing steering committee included members from other communities, and that again provides a more complete picture of what you're dealing with and ultimately what you're going to have, the solutions that you're going to propose to address whatever issues are identified. Creates strong allies, and it engages people in the process, which again strengthens your ability to execute after you get the study completed. Next slide, please. Here again, we're describing the makeup of the steering committee, broad coalition of key stakeholders and civic leaders, and broad-based funding. It just strengthens the overall process and engages the community. And I can't overemphasize, I think, the importance of a broad community engagement in this process, because oftentimes people in a community will have preconceived notions about what the housing issues are and how to solve those. And there are any number of different areas or potholes that you can step into. And having a broader coalition allows you to avoid some of those potential pitfalls. If you can go to the next slide, please. So who's going to use this housing study once you've got it completed? A whole range of people find the data actually invaluable. Municipal planners, of course, when they're laying out the growth patterns of the city's future, the county's future, private developers and contractors. This is a risk management tool for them, actually, because they can see through the study what the demand is going to be, where the market voids are, and what the price points are for them to focus on. And if your local contracting community is not able to perform those kinds of responses, then the study's invaluable when you're talking to developers or contractors from outside the market. Lenders need it. That helps them support and justify their participation in projects. Public and private schools can see where schools and other resources need to be applied, and that gives them some sense of what the future might look like as well, so they can make their planning decisions. And then grant providers like DED and other foundations or organizations that provide funding find these kinds of studies not only helpful but essential. You're simply not going to get very far in a housing-oriented grant application without verifiable data, and the housing study is one of those things that performs that. Michelle, you've been involved in a number of these kinds of things before.
I can remember the big first grant that we went after was a DED workforce housing grant, and the first requirement in applying for that was to have a current housing study.
Yeah.
Without it, we couldn't even apply. So it was really important to get that piece in place first.
And we recently applied for well, the LB 518 grant, but
yeah, that we just applied for.
yeah.
Yeah.
So again, the housing study is a very important tool in order to be successful there. Next slide, please. Other ancillary benefits of a housing study is essentially it just gives you a target to shoot at. You know what the needs of the community are, and you're able to put your focus there. Employers often value the process because they, you know, houses are where the jobs actually live. So employers want to know that they have a healthy environment where their employees can live and that the market is responding to their needs. That strengthens the relationship between the community and the employer. It engages the community. Volunteers become advocates, and the more people you have at the table, the more advocates you end up having, and it just sends positive ripple effects throughout the entire community. Next slide, please, Sherry. This is an example of some of the data that we got in our most recent housing study, and you can see it measured the kind of housing that was required in our county. And if we go to the Holdridge line there, you can see that owner-occupied houses, they established a demand of 86 units over a 5-year period in our market, and 72 rental units in the market over that same time frame, for a total of 158 living units. The red number beside each of those is how our market has actually responded 3 years into the study. So we've created 6 owner-occupied units. That's a disappointing number to us. We're doing better on the rental side, and I think that we'll see both the rental and the owner-occupied numbers bump up quite quickly in the year 2020. And that demonstrates that sometimes it takes a while to see results. The community gets the information, and then you've got to put this information into practice, into action, and the results can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So far, 3 years in, we've created 48 units out of the 158 the housing study estimated that we needed. If you can go on to the next slide. These are some of the things that we developed as a result of our local housing study here. We created, as Sharon said earlier, the Go Home programs, and over a 2.5-year period, we've been able to capture 160 plus new people into our county using the Go Home programs. We have a down payment assistance program that is run through employers. So our assistance is actually to the employer, not directly to the employee. And we essentially match a dollar for dollar match for whatever an employer is willing to contribute to encourage their commuting employee to live here. So the program is essentially targeting people that are not currently in Phelps County to relocate them to live within the county. We also had, for a 2-year period, a renter relocation program, which was also a grant program, didn't require an employer match, but it required the employee to apply through the employer. And that was a smaller grant amount, and that also produced pretty good results. But this year we've suspended that program in favor of plussing up the down payment assistance program, because we feel like we get more bang for the buck when people are actually buying houses. Our Go Dream program is targeting our downtown sector, and it's essentially got 3 different parts, but part of it is encouraging the development of downtown living units, and we've had some success there, and we've got several projects in the queue that we hope to see completed this year. The downtown living, we recognize that adapting existing space that was built maybe 100 years ago into modern living conditions carries a lot of additional cost and risk to the developer. So we're providing up to a $10,000 grant per new living unit created in the downtown area. And that is designed to mitigate some of the additional expense that somebody may encounter as a result of adapting an older building. We think that we may have another half a dozen units coming online this year in downtown Holdridge. We also provide assistance to help developers or contractors address things like roofs that or other structural deficiencies in a building that may prevent them from doing any other kind of modifications or renovations to the building. So as we discussed earlier, we've used the housing study to support our LB 518 workforce housing grant. PCDC contributed $250,000 from its LB 840 fund to provide the seed money to win the 518.5, I think it is, from DED and NIFA. And mentioning NIFA, they are a terrific partner when it comes to conducting local housing studies. They were a 50% funding partner for our local study, which on a countywide basis, I think the cost was about $30,000. So we got $15,000 from NIFA. That was very, very helpful in pushing us over the finish line. So what am I missing, Michelle?
Well, I think one of the things that struck me, I guess, is I don't know how many communities have actually gone through the process of a housing study, but when Ron talks about building a coalition and bringing people of all different aspects of housing to the table so we can get this housing study done, it's actually the process of getting the housing study done. We were fortunate enough to be working with Hannah Keelan. They brought people out into our community. We had several meetings where we had folks come in from the outlying villages. We had older people who were expressing an interest for downsizing. We had young people wanting to get a starter home. And then we had some managers, particularly BD, and then some of the hospital who was trying to bring in doctors that wanted some of the higher end. So you get this whole mix of all these different types of people. And Hannah Keelan actually brings you together in meetings, community meetings, and asks questions, asks for information, gave us homework assignments. And so when we talk about building coalitions and partnerships and listening to each other, making sure we're addressing all the community needs, we did a lot of that through the whole process of getting the study done. So I think that was something that we maybe didn't talk a whole lot about in the last 30 minutes, but I think just getting that done made the whole study worthwhile. And Holdridge, I think the city's required to do one every 5 years, or is it 15 years? I can't remember. I'm sorry. I don't remember what that number is, but
I think a housing study is required in their comprehensive plan, and that's a 15-year requirement.
15-year, okay.
So, but we would recommend doing them more frequently than that. Really, the information contained in our last housing study has a 5-year lifespan, and then it will need to be updated. I think that's about everything we've got, and we're happy to open it up for questions, and we'll do our best.
Okay. So we've had some questions entered into the chat box for you, Ron.
Okay.
Dina was asking a couple questions early on. She asked about how could philanthropic dollars be utilized in addressing housing issues in town, in a community. And then she asked what were some of the barriers to growth.
Can you address the philanthropic part?
Well, you know, we're fortunate to have a Phelps County Foundation, and the kind of funds that they were offering, I think, was a $2,500 grant, and they've got some pretty broad, I guess, parameters on what they can do for the community, and they felt that addressing housing was so important to the community that that was something that the community needed and wanted to get done, and they were happy to stand behind it and help us get the work done. I've never served on that particular board, so I'm not sure all their parameters, but I know that I was told that whenever there's a need in the community that they feel is important to get done, they can use these smaller $2,000 to $2,500 grants to help us out. And so that's what they did. I don't know if that
Okay.
answers your question, but
Okay. She had asked about barriers to growth. What did you maybe encounter or notice or discover?
So Ron, I was looking specifically at that slide that you had up that you needed, can't remember, 68 houses, but you only had 6. And so I'm wondering, 86, 68, 86, that's close. So what are the barriers to that? Is it space? Just
It's a variety of things, Dina. And that's
everywhere.
yeah. Certainly, having lots prepared is a big challenge. It's expensive. Cities are risk averse in that they don't like to spend money to develop subdivisions and things of that sort, and neither do developers when the uncertainty about how soon those lots are going to sell or houses are going to be developed. And that's one of the things that helped us with this LB 518 grant. We're going to have a subdivision constructed utilizing those funds that will allow us to build houses but keep the development costs for the lots low. Lot development is one of the more expensive parts and one of the more difficult parts of creating housing in your local communities. And in some cases, you're going to find communities that are much more progressive or willing to take on that risk. But it's more likely than not that they're going to want the private sector to fund all of that. So that's why these broader coalitions that we've talked about several times are important, so that you get people at the table and you start having these conversations and you build consensus, and that consensus spills over into confidence for the city councils and mayors and other governmental bodies that may be involved in this sort of thing. They need to have a strong sense of support from the community for them to take these kinds of risks. Oftentimes, smaller Nebraska communities are not going to have a pool of experienced tradesmen or contractors that can work on this too. And so there's always this tendency on the part of communities to want things to be funded and completed using local contractors. And that's a big barrier right there, because they're few and far between. Oftentimes they're busy and they can't take on a bigger workload. So housing becomes one of those things that just doesn't get done on a timely basis in communities. So you've got to work on this problem from a lot of different directions. The question about the foundation, we've got a relationship with our community foundation to help fund scholarships in our high demand job categories. And construction trades is one of those categories. And so we're trying to fund the education of young people that are already here that will agree to come back here and work in those areas. So it's a challenge with a long horizon. You need to be prepared for that and continue to work on every pothole as it presents itself.
Okay. Glenn asked about their community had completed a housing study in 2018. Is that study still considered valid? How would you respond to that?
I'd say yes. It has a 5-year lifetime, I think. If it was a comprehensive study. sometimes a study may be project specific. Developers oftentimes will do a housing study that's specific only to their project. But for the kind of study that we've engaged in, you can probably count on a 5-year life.
Okay, and I think I heard you mention too that sometimes even though the study is done, it takes some time to get momentum built to
Yeah.
address those issues that were identified in the study. So good questions. What other questions do you have for Ron and Michelle this afternoon?
You know, this isn't a question, but I just want to mention some of you are from really small communities, and finding the funding for that housing study is really, really difficult. And Lori mentioned or pointed out at the top of the program that NIFA has their grant program that will pay half of a housing study if you're just doing a standalone housing study. And they have an extra round coming up real soon. But a group of housing professionals across the state also developed something called the Housing Study Lite. So you can do some of that yourself and maybe partner with your local development district or a consultant, or maybe you have somebody in your community that's capable of doing it all. And really doing something to address your issues is better than doing nothing. Doing something to get started. And that Housing Study Lite is available on the HomeNE website, which is sched.us/HomeNE, and I'm sure it'll be up here at the end on the slide. But I just want to mention that if you're just getting started and you don't know where to start and you have some people power, but maybe not a lot of money, that's a place to start.
One other thing I'd add to that, Sharon, something that we're exploring here in Holdridge that we've seen in other communities that have experienced some terrific success. For example, Central City has established an investment club. Yeah. And I think that Cliff Messner has helped other communities duplicate what they've done in Central City. And essentially, you're creating a pool of money through like-minded investors who have a profit motive, by the way. But you're creating a pool of money that's available to be invested in housing developments. Can be single-family neighborhoods. It could be apartment buildings. I think they've done retirement homes or assisted living homes in Central City. But they've also done commercial and industrial buildings with those investment clubs. And the intention is to not lose money. They want to make money, but the idea is that you have a pool of money available to invest when the opportunity presents itself. And that's one of the big challenges. We oftentimes develop the project first and then try to figure out where to find the money to fund it. I think the investment club concept makes a lot of sense, and we're having our first meeting in Holdridge on February 25th, next week.
Okay. Ron, I've got some good questions for you here in the chat box. Glenn wanted to know how you connect or contact potential contractors or developers who may be interested in working with you. Do you advertise, or is there a list of recommended builders?
We created a builders bureau, and we recognize that there are tradesmen and general contractors in our market, but not all of them are interested in housing, or maybe they have a particular category of housing that they are experts in. We found that in our market, our general contractors tend to focus on the higher end housing. Not many are interested in doing what we categorize as workforce housing or lower. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do was create some sort of communications device that would connect us with all of the subcontractors and general contractors, not just in Holdridge, but in our region. And over time, we push out bid opportunities that may come from either engineering or architectural firms from across the state for projects that are in our region. And that helps them connect with those projects. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, sometimes they don't even bid on it. But at least it's a vehicle where we develop a relationship with our local contractors. And then what we hope is that by building more opportunities, we also build interest in our market and the opportunities that are there. Oftentimes it's a lack of information about what the market needs and how to go about doing it. But we just think over time we'll make progress by working through this Builders Bureau. We've also had members join our Builders Bureau from outside the market. There's always a thread of discontent when somebody from outside the market wins a job or is a developer of a job. But what we try to do is emphasize that we're importing money into the market when that happens. And we always try to make those bid opportunities available to our Builders Bureau so that they have at least the chance to participate in a project.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question here from someone. They asked, could you address the infrastructure aspect? How does that get paid for on newly undeveloped land outside of the city doing it? How do you address infrastructure on undeveloped land?
It's for us, it's on a project by project basis. The city is not in a position, excuse me, has not been in a position to do speculative infrastructure development. For the workforce housing subdivision that we're currently developing, we use the grant funds that we received through the LB 518 grant to buy the TIF bonds that are supporting the development of the infrastructure on that project. We're going to create 40 housing, 40 units in that subdivision. I think we'll have 26 of them completed this year. So that'll leave the remainder to complete in the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, however long it takes.
We used LB 840 funds.
Yeah, we used our LB 840 funds to seed that project. But what happens then is, since we bought the TIF bonds, we'll get repaid through property taxes over time and recover all those funds. And then we'll plow that money back into other projects as time goes on.
Okay, thank you. I just also want to draw your attention to the chat box. Chris had shared some information regarding the Incremental Development Alliance that Megan Weaver in Wakefield is utilizing to bring communities, contractors, and others together. So he has put Megan's contact information in there, and I know Megan has participated in HomeNE. So thanks, Chris, for sharing that. What other questions do you have for Ron or Michelle, or comments?
I have a question for SCAD. Could somebody address what kinds of housing studies or what kind of support SCAD provides to communities?
Certainly, we can do a complete housing study. We've done housing studies in combination with the Community Needs Assessment Survey. So that's even a little more comprehensive. If you're going to do a survey in your community, we ask a lot of housing questions anyway. So that's a good time to do a housing study with that. We've done standalone housing studies. We have done, helped with the Housing Study Light, partnered with the community to do that. So kind of a variety of things. We really try to work with the community based on their size and their funding. And we don't have a planner on staff right now, but we have had planners in the past or partnered with a planner to do a complete NIFA not only has the 50% grant for a housing study, they'll do 30% if you're doing a comprehensive plan with a housing study. So we've done the full-blown comp plan, blight study, zoning update, housing study. It really depends on what does the community need. We just don't do a one size fits all because our communities aren't one size fits all.
Sharon, can SCED help a community develop an application to NIFA?
Certainly. Yeah, we do that. We have done, we've helped with, I don't know, probably half a dozen over the last couple of years. But you know, I want you to hear that Ron said, you know, 5 years is probably right. And I want to draw your attention to something that, I don't want to politicize this, but the legislature has been asked to consider a $10 million allocation from general funds to the Rural Workforce Housing Fund, which would give a lot more communities an opportunity to apply for that money. There was a one-time allocation a few years ago of $7 million. 14 applications were funded through that, and we were very grateful for that. But there were a lot of communities that didn't really have time to get things in order. Their housing study had to be within 2 years. But that is a requirement of that legislation, that the housing study has to be completed within 2 years. And that's a really short time. As you can see, Ron showed they need 86 owner occupied, and they've gotten 6 to date. It takes a long time to implement these and to get projects going. So in fact, you know, we ordered a modular house a year and a week ago that we thought we would have in June, and it's not here yet. So sometimes projects, you know, bomb cyclones and flooding and whatever, it's just a ripple effect. And so if you have the opportunity, you might mention that to your senator, that 2 years maybe isn't long enough, but we are very thankful for that funding. But again, it will require a housing study, at least for the application. And so this is a good time to really be thinking about that. We didn't have this topic today by chance. We did it because we feel like it's important. We know that rural workforce application or legislation is in. We know NIFA is having an extra round of funding for that housing study. And so I think each of the development districts would do, we don't all do exactly the same, but certainly could provide some assistance and some expertise as you're developing whatever it is that's the right size for your community.
Okay. Ron and Michelle, Matthew wants to know, what's the most surprising thing you learned from your housing study? And what surprised you the most when you dove into the study's data? Can you address that?
Well, one of the things that maybe surprise is not precisely the right word, but one of the revealing things that comes about is that you learn how old your housing stock is. In our community, I don't remember the number, but the numbers of homes that are more than 50 years old or more than 75 years old and many more than 100 years old, it's just an astounding number. And when you think about it, younger families are not really interested in living in homes that have not been updated at the very least. Oftentimes they're looking for modern amenities that you just can't put into an older home. So we have an overabundance of homes that are just past their prime. And that further exacerbates the problem when you look at adding 86 new units and coupling that to so many units that are outdated and in some cases not occupiable, but in many cases they are badly outdated and need a lot of investment in them.
And that was a big surprise for me, was the percent of homes that we have, you know, that even the ones that we consider new, and you look at them and you go, oh my gosh, that whole neighborhood was actually built in 1964, you know, and the number of homes that were over 50 and 75 years old, the percentage of the town that's that old really did surprise me. And it pointed out that, you know, housing isn't just about going on the outskirts and growing your town so that everything new is all on the outskirts. We also really have to do a much better job of taking down some of those older neighborhoods and turning the houses and changing them and rehabbing the ones that can be saved. And so housing is just, there's always something that needs to be done with housing.
Sure.
And one of the markets that we've identified, and is probably true in virtually every community on the call today, but we have aging citizens that are in the family home that was designed for the family. And it may be time, they may prefer a more modern, smaller, and less maintenance intensive home. And so by providing that market segment solution, you also free up another segment that could be updated for younger families.
Okay. We have a question about lot sizes, and are you finding it to be a problem that they are maybe substandard for infill? Is that a challenge that you're seeing?
Certainly. Many of the older lots are on the 50-foot basis, and newer lots are 75 to 100 or more. And, you know, articulating current building codes to, you know, what occurred 100 years ago, that's a challenge because in many cases, houses that need to be demolished in an infill situation can't be replaced based on current setback requirements and that sort of thing. So you need to work with the building department and the planning commission to update your planning and zoning ordinances so that you have the flexibility to perform infill development as well as new development.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ron. But I also think we're seeing a group of a demographic that doesn't maybe want the big yard, and so in some areas we're seeing entire new developments come in that are that have higher density, you know, smaller yards and all. And I do think that we have to start looking at how can we put that in our older neighborhoods. We can't just keep going to the edge of town and putting in a new development, and especially our smaller communities. That infrastructure, as somebody brought up, is really, really a big deal. So I think being creative with infill, maybe really looking at, as you're taking down dilapidated homes, can you find several on one street, you know, where then if you needed to, you can reconfigure and or do some higher density kinds of things. I think we have to really look at our own circumstances, our own community, and get creative.
That's right, and that's why having a good relationship with your planning commission or planning and zoning department, the city council, is important, because oftentimes the existing building codes don't permit the kind of infill development that you're describing, Sharon, or there just may be other things that prevent you from utilizing the existing infrastructure.
Yeah.
True, true. Well, as we're approaching our 3 o'clock time frame, are there any last questions for Ron or Michelle? Any final thoughts? I have a question for our group today. What have you learned, or what might you be willing to share that you learned through participation in the HomeNE network today? What's something you're taking away from today that you maybe hadn't thought of before, or saw differently today? You're all just soaking. Oh, Dina mentions that NIFA pays for half of the housing studies. She had known that before, but today was a great reminder of that. And that is something that's very valuable. Ron, I think you said yours for Phelps County was about 30-some thousand. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so to get half of that paid for, that was a big cost saving. So Miles said that he liked using 518 funds to purchase TIF back. So very creative. So good. Thank you for sharing that, Miles and Dina. So what else?
Because we got to hear about the PCDC programs at our gathering and actually drive around and see those from our little bus tour, it wasn't new, but I love the incentives that PCDC has been able to offer. Not even huge, but 5,000. It's kind of like North Platte's Shot in the Arm program, where it's not a big incentive, but when we're working on rehab, which some of your programs were, or North Platte new building, anytime we can add, we're building it. Workforce housing is lower margin. You know, Ron, you mentioned the contractors here want to build the bigger, more custom. They're higher margins. They can make more money. So when they go into rehab or building for the workforce housing, the lower end market rate, the margins are so much lower. And so I just always, I just want more and more stories about how did somebody incentivize those workforce housing programs, you know, so that we can get more contractors to do those projects and turn more houses in our communities.
Okay. Well, as we begin to wrap up, Matthew really appreciated your point, Ron, that bringing in volunteers and leveraging them as advocates for housing development was so important. So that was a takeaway that he has for today. So continue to add to the chat box and we'll be reading those as a group. But as we begin to wrap up for the afternoon, I just wanted to mention that our spring gathering, we are starting to plan for that and be watching in your emails in the near future for additional information on that. But as I mentioned earlier, as we started, that today's topic was really a result of someone asking at our fall gathering that we have a conversation centered on housing studies and how to utilize them. So my question for you today as we begin to wrap up here, is there a housing topic that you want to see on a future webinar? We'd really like to hear from you. We put our heads together often and try to think of relevant and timely housing topics, but this was brought to you by somebody who attended a gathering today. So drop us an email or give us a call. Sharon, Levi, and my contact information are there on your screen. And we'd really like to hear from you. And as Sherry's reminding us, all past webinars are on our website. The Investment Club came up and we had a speaker a year and a half ago roughly, speak about the importance of investment clubs and utilizing those. So check those out. Give us a call, drop us a line, let us know what you'd like to see on a future webinar or maybe at a future gathering. So Ron and Michelle, I just want to say thank you to you again for being here and presenting a wealth of information. You've made yourselves available, and if somebody has questions as a follow-up to today, how might they get a hold of you?
Well, the email address is on the slide at the beginning of the presentation, but to repeat that, you can reach me at ron@phelpscountynE.com. ron@phelpscountynE.com.
Okay. And Michelle?
And my contact is also on the same page, but it's mhigh@broodingbank.com.
Okay, and for those of you who are asking, today's slides will be made available. Sherry's great about getting those out to everybody who registered. If not this afternoon, maybe tomorrow or Monday. So you will be getting your own copy of today's slides from from Ron and the webinar. So just to let you know what's coming up in March, I'm equally excited. We just keep getting great presentations month after month. And next month, our webinar will be on March 19th, and Doug Coe from Boone County will be joining us and talking about housing progress through partnerships. He'll be speaking specifically about the village of Petersburg and the city of Albion and how they started a process just a few years ago and how they're adding new housing units to their communities. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Doug. He spoke a few years ago at NIFA about that topic, and progress has continued even since he did that presentation. So I hope you will make it a point to join us on March 19th. So with that, are there any last questions or comments? I see we've put some stuff in the chat box, so check that out. Dina, thank you for your comment. So we will check that out as a future topic. So any last questions or comments before we say see you next month? So
Lori,
yes.
one last thing. If anybody is interested to know more about our housing, our Go Home and Go Dream programs, we have a description of the programs and also the application online at phelpscountynE.com.
Okay, great. Those are great programs. I've seen those in action, and Sharon mentioned them as well. And they are making things happen here in Holdridge and Phelps County. So thanks to PCDC for doing that. So any other comments or questions before we close for the day? Okay. If not, thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. And we will see you back here on March 19th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.